Hello and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, the founder of Utrema Limited. And today's topic is, I read an article it was about how Egypt was trying to compete with Morocco for greenhouse growing and fresh produce production in the coming years. And I talked about Morocco in the past and said, they've got vast quantities of desalination plants being created that will take them, a factor of like 10 or 100 times greater desalinated water production than, say, the USA or even the UAE and countries like that. So Morocco massively increasing their water production because that's the limiting factor. The water coming down from the Atlas Mountains is not enough. They've not got enough desalination plants. Not sure how they're going to power all those desalination plants, whether that's going to be fossil fuels or some solar power, but we wait to see. But Egypt wants to compete with them, and they normally, horticulture in Egypt is very field-based production. Obviously, the fresh water from the Nile is the feedstock for that, and they're very big in production of crops like onions and potatoes, but they want to get into the fresh produce sector and they want to get into the greenhouse sector. So they're building very large-scale greenhouses. And what was surprising about this was that it was actually the army that was building these and constructing these. And I was thinking, what are the army getting involved in food? So I asked ChatGPT, I said, what does the Egyptian army have to do with food production in Egypt? And it turns out the Egyptian army is massive when it comes to food production. For a sort of non-dictatorship, non-authoritarian, well, you might claim that Egypt is, but some people might, but Human Rights Watch and things like that. But for what is considered a democracy, the army, the military, is massively involved in food production, and to the point where some of the farmers are complaining, like they're massively involved in fish farming, and they've been accused of putting other smaller fish farms out of business, and they're building massive amounts of greenhouses as well. It's not just to feed the army; it's for production as well, and so they're involved in the construction and the running of these national projects, 1,000 hectares of greenhouse for national projects. And obviously they're involved in the production, the supply chain for the raw materials and fertilizers and things like this. So that's really interesting. And they're getting into berries as well. So strawberries and blueberries. Blueberries are massive in Morocco. So Egypt wants a slice of that pie as well. So large scale hydroponic greenhouses are being set up, and you can understand why the land next to the Nile is being developed, and the land further away from the Nile is not as conducive for food production. So if you can go in hydroponics, soilless cultivation, then that could be winner chicken dinner. You just need to pipe the water from the Nile to that land. Other countries where the army and the military is involved in food production, obviously it's apart from Egypt, which is probably the only democracy where that is the case. Maybe Pakistan. North Korea is the obvious one where the army involved in the military involved in everything of everyday life in food production. So everything that runs through the military junta. Myanmar, now that was a democracy, gone back to a military junta as well, isn't it? I think that's the word you call it. And obviously involved in the supply, a lot of backhanders and things like this, but not as much as Egypt. Egypt, even though it's not an authoritarian regime, it's more military, more involved in food production in Egypt than they are in Myanmar. And Pakistan as well, the military have a much higher role in everyday society as well. It's not just food production in places like Pakistan and Myanmar, and hence the power of the military in places like Egypt and Pakistan, hence why you often get coups, because there's a lot of money going through the military and there's a lot of influence and power in the military. So more than, say, in the UK, where if the army tried to get involved in food production, then they would be laughed out of town. They can only just sort of put on some temporary fire engines when there's a fire engine strike. They certainly couldn't get involved in food production. Whereas in places like Egypt, the army can bake 1 million loaves a day. That's their capacity in food production, which is crazy, isn't it? And Egypt is obviously a massive population, one of the world's biggest wheat importers. It's got to feed around 70 million people, and the army is involved in that. So, yeah, I think that's really interesting. If you know of other countries where the army is involved in food production, then let me know. Often it can be at the detriment to the wider population. So like in Myanmar, because of the money involved, it can be like pushing farmers out of land and planting rubber plantations where for non-food, for exports, which gain, a dollar income to the country. But obviously the local population suffer then because their local food production is disrupted. And then obviously mega projects in these countries are often have military involvement. So yes, let me know if you're in places like, it'd be interesting to know. I mean, I've been to China. I've not seen any military involvement in the agriculture there. Cuba, even though that's communist, they have the organoponics, which is not really hydroponics, but yeah, the sort of sugarcane production, I would imagine, has some sort of military involvement, but I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to talk about that. If you know, let me know, and I'm more than happy to do a follow-up. The military involvement in hydroponics. It's really interesting. All right, if you found it interesting, please do like this podcast and give it a review on Apple Podcasts, because it helps share the word of hydroponics with the wider community. If you are not on Apple, don't leave a podcast review because it doesn't really help, but just make sure you follow the podcast and check out utrema.co.uk. Whether you are a military general or a guerrilla soldier or a peace-loving atheist, peacenik, anti-war person, then check out utrema.co.uk for all your fertilizers. Yeah. Oh, we did talk about Israel, didn't we, in the past, and how the Gaza 585 were burning greenhouses down in southern Gaza, funded by ICL, the fertilizer company. But yeah, we'll not cover that one again because I don't want another solicitor's letter from ICL. All right. Thanks very much for listening. I'll speak to you tomorrow for another podcast of Hydroponics Daily.